just tuning in, first of all, welcome. And I am so excited to introduce you to one of my favorite people. Her name is Annie, and she is a public school teacher. She is currently in grad school studying to become a doctor of education. What is it called? So not a PhD, but
it's an EdD, EDD.
EDD, like Dr. Jill Biden.
Like Dr. Jill Biden.
Yeah, and so Annie, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, we say you're a teacher. Like, what do you teach? What's your background? And then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, background, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so Southwest is very near and dear to my heart. Came out here for college, completed my undergrad degree at Stanford, majored in ethnic studies and English. After that, I knew I wanted to be a teacher partway through and decided I was going to stay on another year to get my teaching credential and a master's. And since then, I have been teaching all sorts of humanities subjects and got really into health education in San Francisco Unified. This year, I am teaching 8th grade. My first time teaching middle school, which is everything you would expect, wonderful and chaotic and strange and, an adventure every day. So this year I'm teaching social studies and English language arts, but honestly, developmentally, given where they're at, every day is also just like another health lesson. Like I believe very grateful that I have so much experience in it because it comes in handy every day.
I'm sure. So like, what's the biggest difference you've noticed from teaching high school age kids? Because I know before you were teaching not that much older, like 9th grade. But, given that these are kids still in middle school, what are some of the biggest differences that you've noticed?
I would say that I personally don't see a huge difference between 8th graders and 9th graders. I think it's just that their reference points are different. So the 8th graders really see themselves as like top of the pack. They run the school. They're in charge. Whereas like the 9th graders are like, oh my gosh, everyone's like larger than me and like what is going and where are my classes? But honestly, we're like 6 weeks in and 8th graders are still like, where's my pencil? What am I doing? Why am I here? So it's still, I tend to I did refer to 9th graders as like oversized puppies. And it kind of feels like the same energy. Like they're just crawling over everything and you're like, what's happening over there? So I would say it's a minor difference. But other than that, like not.
What's it like being back in the classroom, by the way? Because I know, like every other teacher pretty much, the past year has been challenging. We talked a little bit about that the last time you were here and the challenges and, silver linings of distance teaching. But now that you're actually physically back in the classroom, how has that transition back been?
Yeah. I guess maybe I want to start out by saying that the biggest challenge, honestly, is like veering between like completely forgetting we're in a pandemic and like being very aware we're in a pandemic,
Yeah.
Whereas like online learning, it felt like there was just a clear border. Life was so different teaching to a bunch of black box screens on Zoom every day. Whereas like now that we're here in person, it's like on the one hand, kids are wearing masks, and I feel very lucky this year that I'm in a classroom with windows, which I had never been in before.
No more windowless basement?
Not for me, but I'm still thinking about a bunch of my students at the other school side and my former colleagues. So, that's still on my mind, but I feel very grateful. And we just got air purifiers in our classrooms. So that's also good. And another thing to add to figuring things out with students is, masks every day. Like I would say we have a good 95% mask wearing thing, and none of them are actively resistant, but there's just like the nose dropping thing all the time. And it's like,
of course,
over the nose, please, over the nose.
That kind of dovetailed like well into one of the things I wanted to talk about. So I imagine like this mask wearing is another expectation of the kids, but it's also kind of a form of a boundary in a way. But I know that the boundaries you deal with the kids or that you try to instill in them aren't necessarily like physical
Yeah.
boundaries. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about like what boundary setting means to you in that context. And I know you said one of the first things you did this year was have that discussion with
Yeah.
your kids. So like,
Yeah.
what did that look like?
Sure. So I think I spent a lot of time over the summer being like, I don't even remember how to be in a classroom and what I want out of that. And also, this is like an opportunity, hopefully, for me to try some new things. So I thought about it and I was like, okay, if we're in a classroom, the number one thing that I need is like a sense of safety and community. And I know what makes me feel safe is like having clear boundaries, right? And so it's like I knew it'd be a challenge developmentally with that age group
Yeah.
because at that age, like being a teenager, their whole existence is about testing boundaries. Like that's the point of you at that age with your developing prefrontal cortex is you're like, oh, is that a boundary? What should I do with it? Like, should I just like run over it or whatever? So I was like, okay, I'm going to have an easier time navigating that if I am explicit about what boundaries are. And I think it's just going to help in the long run. So I think also through a lot of like thought and processing things, I was like, I've never really liked the word classroom management. Like, I don't really
Your tweet on that
believe.
blew my mind. I loved it so much. But yeah, sorry, go ahead and explain
Oh,
like
you're good. You're good. Yeah.
what
So
that
like,
means.
I think for me, it's like I really can't manage other people, period. Right. Like, I think it's like, it just feels contradictory to be like, oh, we can like control people and manage their behavior. But then you also want to believe that they can have agency and go off and do and learn their own things. Like, if I'm coming in with this idea that I can determine your behavior, you're never, I just feel like it limits the conversation in terms of what students can take for like radical personal responsibilities. So for me, I was like, okay, it was really just about setting boundaries. Like, so beginning of the school year, I just taught a lesson in English language arts about boundaries and what they are. We watched a little Brene Brown clip. We processed like the importance of it. And then they made little zines, like little 6-page zines, and talked about like what does safety look like and what does it look like for me to set my boundaries, what are some boundaries I have, what am I okay with and what am I not okay with, and what happens when I do, like when people cross my boundaries. And then on the back I asked them like, who's your support system, right, when setting boundaries, who are the people you can go to really make sure that you're aligned and stuff. So I would say it's still hard, but just the fact that like that vocabulary is available to us on a daily basis has been really helpful. And they say it with each other jokingly. So that's the other thing about that age group is like they, once they've decided that they can make someone laugh with a joke, they're just going to recycle it over and over again.
Sure.
So there was a lot of like, you're messing with my boundaries, like kind of thing. But I do think that it has opened up so much more space to be like, wait, so is someone met? Like, it gives me opportunities to intervene and slow things down and have a conversation, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so are you, it sounds like you're crossing his boundaries. He's asking you to stop, right? Like, so it has just opened up like so much more language for us, I think, together in the classroom.
Awesome. Yeah. And I mean, have you done this exercise before? And if you have, no, so this is the first time that you've ever done this sort of like, um, up at the, like, right out the gate boundary
Mm-hmm.
setting. And I love that you included, not only like, here are my boundaries, but then, the next step, what happens, who are my support system? Because that's so vital to that conversation. You're not an island in this, right?
Yeah. Right. Right.
So this is the first time you've done that. So how do you think it went? Do you think it was successful? And
Oh
like,
yeah. I mean, so
what would
I
you
guess
change
that,
maybe next time?
yeah, yeah. So this is my first time doing it just right out the gate as like a beginning of year thing. In the past, when I was teaching health education, which is a requirement in San Francisco for all ninth graders, which I love and adore, and they're working on kind of increasing the K-8 health education as well. And honestly, in my dream world, health ed at every level of education, just all the time. Like there's so much to dig into. Um, but I think that I used to teach boundaries within the sexuality and relationships unit, which happened closer to the end of the year. So It's nice to start it out. And it's interesting though, because I'm like, oh, that landed differently because we had talked about all these other things. And now I'm kind of going in reverse. So I have yet to talk about like, how do we define sex and gender? And, let's talk about your sleep and your nutrition and all these other things, substance use, right? All these things, which I'll fold in a little bit at a time, but we're not there yet. So I would say it's going really well. We talked about classroom boundaries, and it honestly, like, you can't change culture overnight. And oftentimes, like, young people are coming in with all these other things, and they have their own relationships with each other. So it's a process. And I think that, I don't know if I would change anything for now, but I think that maybe I would build out more structures each week. Oh, and now this is making me think, I guess where this folds in well is that I also have my own thoughts and philosophies on grading. And so 50% of students' grades are self-assessed in my classroom. So at the end of each week, they filled out a little reflection, and then they ask themselves, what grade do you think you earned in this class this week? And tell me a little, mini paragraph why. They had a really strong positive response to talking about boundaries. They were like, oh, I never thought about what I was okay and what I wasn't okay before. And it's like cool that you can do that. And it gives like me more language to say no and stuff. But now I'm thinking about it like what if I just like added the boundaries reflection to each week as part of the self-assessment? Like, was I able to hold my boundaries this week, or did I respect other people's boundaries, and maybe being more explicit about that language? And I'm like, this is an interesting thought.
No, and I love that. I didn't realize it was 50% of the grade is their self-assessments. I mean, that must be like, first of all, empowering for the students. And what's the like? So I guess when you explain that to the class and they learn that like, oh, 50% of this is mine, and then it actually goes into practice. What does that look like? Like, do you find that they're generally pretty honest about their own development? Do you think they're like harder on themselves than they need to be? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, the whole range. I would say that, so I've also been doing self-assessments for, I think, 5 years now. It actually came out because I used to teach college and career readiness, and we were talking about what's the purpose of school, right? Like, I was like, we got to talk about high school a little bit before we can talk about college and career. And so we were looking at it and interrogating things like, why is high school 4 years? Why do we have to take these classes? Like, how do I read a transcript? What is it supposed to do for me? And I remember talking about grades.
All great questions.
And we watched a video, and I think it mentioned Kentucky, maybe, where there was a school district experimenting with sending home not only grades, but like a kind of student / teacher created set of comments and information, like their own grades. And like the students were like, wait, can we do that? And I was like, yeah, sure. So then starting the next semester, that's when I was like, yeah, why don't you guys grade yourselves? And I would say it's like very consistent results in that I would say a good 90% of them are pretty spot on about like self-awareness and how the week went and judging themselves. And I think it helps for them to see the longer arc of like, sometimes you have off weeks and that's okay. And I can still see the path to the grade that I want.
Yeah.
I have, and then, I tell them this jokingly, and then I probably have like 4% of kiddos who have pretty overblown egos or really insecure about getting the right grade. So they just put in an A every week, despite the fact that they've done nothing. And I'm like, okay, that's like, and then probably like the rest of it are also a handful of kids who are a little too hard on themselves, right? So honestly, like, I try to push self-assessments to other teachers all the time because I'm like, y'all, when we do this, we save ourselves all the time. Like, because then you can just focus on the 10% who like either are too hard on themselves or really just have no idea where they are. And like that's really where you should be focusing your energy, right? And then you just affirm that the other kids like know what they're doing. and they're aware of what's going on, and they're learning and they're processing. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I love self-assessments. They save me an immense amount of time, and they're also really fun, and I love reading their reflections.
Totally. I mean, and I love that this was spurned out of questions around like, well, what's the purpose of school? Like, why is
Mm-hmm.
this 4 years? Why do we have to take these classes? Whatever. And that alludes a little bit to, or relates a bit to, um, this. I don't know why it became like the discourse of the week, or like where it originated from, but at least here in streamer land, the question about mandatory schooling has been this like big hotly debated issue, and whether or not it makes sense from a policy standpoint
Mm-hmm.
to make school compulsory.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I learned so much, first of all, about education from your tweets, also your blog posts. We'll get into the abundance education in a second, but like I wanted to get your thoughts on mandatory, like the idea that schooling should be mandatory, because as an educator, like I can't imagine someone with a more in-depth view of what
Yeah.
the pluses and maybe unforeseen consequences of something like that. So just on the surface, like what are your thoughts on something like policy that would make um, schooling mandatory?
Yeah. Well, I mean, can you be a little bit more specific? Because I feel
Yeah,
like as it exists, right, like first grade through, I think it's like what, 5 through 17, like you are supposed to be in school.
in
So like, what
certain
exactly is the debate
yeah.
about?
So in certain states, I believe the age range is it's like 16, 6 through 16. You
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
must be in school. But one of the drawbacks of that is that, say, like truancy is something that is can be punishable.
Yeah.
Where the child, in some cases, if they're missing a lot of school, and it can be deemed as like a they can remove the child from like the parent's home in some cases. But essentially, I think so, because I separate out my own like personal philosophy from this is me being like an armchair you know um, participant in this conversation, is that I think education should be mandatory. Like I think there should be a mandatory education, but
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to schooling, I guess the way I have interpreted it, in the discussions that have been happening on Twitch, on Twitter, has been like schooling in the sort of current system we have.
Yeah.
One of the things I remember we talked about the last time I had you on, was sort of talking about like, well, how do we make schools safe? And
Yeah.
I loved that you responded to that by saying, well, like, schools aren't, that's acting like they were safe in the first place, and that for a lot of kids they aren't.
Yeah.
They're not quote safe spaces, and rather than making it's sort of this one size fits all, like fixed pace um, learning style that is so rigid in its
Nope.
structure. And so I guess thinking about the purpose of education in our country and thinking about the way that we administer it right now, just when ideally, like what would a education system, like what policies do you think would improve education system? And like maybe when we think about when people are advocating for mandatory schooling in its current form, so
Right. Right.
um, what what are some like potential consequences of that maybe someone who doesn't work in education or isn't like studying education, that they wouldn't know about?
Sure. I think maybe full disclosure, I love thinking about policy, and I also have this like deeper part of me that is like seriously like anarchist, right?
Yeah,
And like, but in the sense of like, I really believe in self sovereignty, and like when I think about children, it's like if we really want them to own everything about who they are, you have to recognize that they first and foremost have agency over their decision making, their bodies, their autonomy, right? There's a whole ecosystem about how we conceptualize like children that I'm already like grinding up against, where it's like, oh, well, they can't make decisions for themselves and stuff like that. And it's like, well, actually, with the right space and the right supports, you'll find that children can make a lot of decisions for themselves, right? From a really, really early age, right? Young people, when you tell them you can say no and they say no, right? There's so much literature on that. So I think maybe the short answer to start and then elaborating is that I feel like to talk about mandatory schooling is honestly to perpetuate a lot of the ills of like neoliberal policies over the past 40 years, right? And that it's like if you make things mandatory and then your response to people not following the mandate is punishment, oftentimes the people who are most hurt are the people who are already like most marginalized. So when you were talking about truancy, I was thinking about, Kamala Harris, right? And kind of how when she was trying to address the issue here in San Francisco, like understanding the intention behind, of course, like we want children in schools, and of course we want them to have an education and we want them to be safe and supportive spaces. But then like oftentimes these children were truant because there was so much going on in family lives and neighborhoods and situations that you're just continuing to punish the family. And most of the time they were the most marginalized, like Black communities, things like that, right? So I think that's what I worry about when we talk about mandatory schooling. That said, oh my gosh, like, of course, I want policies to change in this country about like how we approach education. And it's like, if you mandate it, but then you continue to make it a completely miserable, horrible, and dangerous experience, right? Then to me, it just amounts to like torture, right? So it's like, oh, you're forced to send your children to like torturous experiences. And under this like guise of it being quote unquote good for them. But in truth, like, I think if we're completely honest with ourselves, like, very rarely do people say, like, I loved every single day of school and it was a place where I learned and everything I learned was relevant. And, I still think like, and most of the time, I think the more common narrative is school was really boring. I like didn't really get much out of it. And I had maybe one or two teachers who really, really cared about me and helped me care about my education and my learning. Like, I would say that's like the median response, And so it's like, well, if we want mandatory schooling, are we really going to invest the money to make school and education what it should be, right? Which is, we're nowhere close to that. So I worry that people are going to like put this mandate down first as if it's going to solve things, as opposed to being like, why don't we just like pour hundreds of billions of dollars into schools first, and then maybe we'd see that like children actually want to learn.
Like I think of, okay, with our current education system, what is the desired outcome? Like if it's the desired outcome that like when like these children become adults and like enter like I am now a citizen, an adult citizen, that they're competent, that they're healthy, because a lot of like what you learn in school isn't just academic stuff. It's social skills, it's like community building, and it's like, okay, if this is the desired outcome, I feel like there's got to be like there's no way that we can accomplish that with a one size fits all approach, and that because that leaves so little room for alternative like methods of learning or being able to adapt to the different needs and different situations for kids that absolutely impact how receptive they are to anything. So like when you think about like what your desired outcome is as a teacher, like if you want to get to the end of the year and feel like I was successful in setting out, what does that look like? What do you see as like the outcome that you want as a teacher for your students?
I would say number one is like joy, like authentic joy of learning. So I think sometimes when I hear people say things like mandatory schooling, they're like, if you don't make things mandatory, then kids are just gonna play their video games and, hang out with their friends and all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but we do make it mandatory. I have kids for whom it is mandatory right now, and they still find a way to check out of the things that they don't want to do. You know what I mean? Like the mandate is not enough. And what it is that like in reality, we have such a limited definition of what learning is, right? Like I want learning to feel joyful. I try to bring it in as much as I can. I also understand that sometimes like learning what drama your best friend has just gotten into over Instagram or Snapchat feels like a really big feeling. And, but they're also learning, right, in that moment how to self regulate, how to like prioritize, how to not get swept away by big feelings, which is something
Totally.
adults still struggle with because, again, that's not incorporated into our school system, right? So,
Yeah.
I do 10 minutes of meditation with the Calm app with them every day, and they're getting the hang of it, right? Like, this huge struggle, but also like long term, I know I started it with some ninth graders, 5 years ago. And then during the pandemic, I had some ninth graders or juniors who had me for ninth grade. They're like, Miss Phan, we need mindfulness. Like, they were like, it's a pandemic. And I was like, you really like, and I had no idea if they were actually doing it on the other side of the screen, right? But they really were. And they said, we really appreciate the 10 minutes of like meditation every day. It like helps because their lives were so chaotic, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just like there's so much that kids need to learn. And we are so normalized to thinking like it's got to be like they have to read at grade level and they have to do arithmetic. And it's like, yeah, and, if they can get a hold of their feelings, like they're not going to be able to learn anything.
Mm-hmm. Or
So,
it's, if you make it, if you make the process of learning this like painful, arduous, like awful thing, then no wonder they want to like stay home and play video
right.
games or just like avoid it, because if they don't see it, I mean, I feel like every single person can like list one teacher that like made them love that subject, but they can also
Mm-hmm.
conversely name whether it's a teacher, whether it was like a school or something that made them just dread going. And it
Yep.
has nothing to do oftentimes with the actual subject matter that they're learning. It doesn't have to do with like, it doesn't mean that they don't like learning or they like
Right.
hate learning, because I think everyone, it's human nature to love learning new things and being curious.
There's
But
literally not a single person who's not curious about something, right? And if they
exactly.
are, like we know what that looks like. That's a huge red flag, right? For so many other things going on. But there's not a
Exactly.
single one of us that every day, like we're reading articles and we're, talking to our like all of that is a process of development and growth and learning, right?
Hmm.
And so to assume that some children don't want to grow is just absolutely, I don't know, preposterous.
Yeah, I also feel like it's sort of like it's through a lens that just views children so poorly. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
through such a pessimistic lens as well. I mean, you spend almost every single day surrounded by kids, and not necessarily like kids from plenty of like different socioeconomic backgrounds. Some who have had varying degrees of um, like hands-on help with academics or other things, or
Yep.
like attention paid to it. So I mean, you see this all the time. I mean, have you? I bet that you've never once had a student who like genuinely um, is just uninterested in anything, or maybe
True.
you have.
Absolutely true. Yeah, no. And I mean, I think it definitely looks that way sometimes. And I have to admit, like so many biases come in and like, what is going on here, kiddo? But
Mm-hmm.
then you find out a lot is going on, right? In my very short relative to other careers, like time teaching, death, sexual violence, abuse, like family separation, divorce, like, murdered siblings, like all this stuff, like,
Jesus.
freak accidents, like just every trauma imaginable, like has touched some aspect of some kids' lives. And some of them it's like extremely compounded, right?
Yeah.
And I think that to not acknowledge their resilience, I'm like, wow, school probably is freaking miserable for you, like deeply miserable, and you're still choosing to be here. Like, that means I have a place to work with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for whatever reason, you made a decision to show up today and that you weighed those odds
Yeah.
and you decided that this was enough, like that's an in.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. So I struggle because sometimes it's like they're not doing anything in class, and I'm like, but they showed up to class. So that means if I can get them to come tomorrow and the next day and the next day, right? Eventually I am going to get them in something, right? Like, but you have to start with wherever they are initially.
So how do you, because I know a lot of times what you say is you're like, I want to instill like the joy of learning in my students. What are some strategies that you use to do that?
Oh yeah, I was just reflecting about like the routines and stuff that I like doing. So, um, what am I thinking of? There's a really great structure called the question formulation technique. I don't use that too often, but something that they talk about are the difference between convergent and divergent questions, or
Huh.
like the convergent and divergent thinking. So, convergent thinking is when you are um, zoning out. Sorry. Like convergent thinking is when you're trying to assess, like, and you're trying to bring things together. Is this the right answer? You're trying to prioritize. You're synthesizing, right? And so oftentimes, like our school systems really value convergent thinking. Like you've got to come to the right answer, which is true. Like sometimes you do need to figure out the right path forward, and you've got to come up with the strongest argument or whatever. That's great. But there also needs to be divergent thinking, which is generative, which creates more opportunities, which is, exploratory and curious. Um, so I think for me, it's nice to start divergent and then move to convergent because then, if you start with asking for the right answer and moving to convergence, but they don't have enough selections to choose from, then like they feel really stuck, right? And then you get this like kind of rote idea that there's only one right answer. But if you kind of explore first, you're like, oh, I could do that. I could do that. Oh, this could work. Oh, this is kind of cool, right? Then you actually generate interesting creativity and get to solutions. So with Do Nows, for example, which is the 5-minute writing warm up, I had amazing advice from my former high school English teacher. I like checked in with her before I started teaching my first year, and she was like, if you're doing a warm up or a writing warm up, you want to ask students the same question that the text is trying to answer. So it's like, like so
Okay.
my common example, yeah, is like, I don't know if I'm teaching Shakespeare, right? And like, so I'm like, okay, like when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, what are the questions he was grappling with, right? So it's like about family and love and conflict and historical trauma and, like youth and all this stuff. So I was like, okay, so if we're thinking about this stuff, I can ask things like, would you ever date someone that your family didn't approve of? You know,
Yeah,
that
good
your
question.
family like then it's like a thing because it asks all these questions of like, is family about loyalty, right? Or is family about supporting you and all these things, right? So it actually, so by the time they get to the Shakespeare, we talk about our examples first or life experience, blah, blah, blah. And they get to Shakespeare, they're like, oh, okay, like I see what's going on. I see what he was trying to answer. And now I can say I agree or disagree with him or add perspective, right? So that's like one example, but that framework in general has been really useful for me for like bringing in the fun and making life connections.
Yeah, I mean, I also love, I mean, the last time you were here, you talked about some of the really cool like projects that you would
Yeah.
have students take on. I mean, I love that even just in the beginning we were talking about boundaries, how you had them make it a zine. So like a short, like 6 page. Do you, what role do you feel that plays in cultivating this like love of learning or getting them engaged? Like, is that why, is that part of the reason why you do like bigger projects rather than just like, all right, write an essay or do this? Like, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, I've been thinking about that. Like for example, I'm like, okay, I kind of do want them to learn how to write, the classic 5-paragraph essay, just because I'm like, yo, if you nail this when you take an AP class, if that's what you want to do,
Yeah.
it'll be easy. You're just gonna
College,
swing through it.
you're
But on
gonna,
the other
yeah,
hand,
college is gonna be a lot easier when you get there. You can like nail down
yeah.
that. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm like, okay, but I learned that and I only learned that. So by the time I got to college, I was like, oh my God, I don't actually know how to push myself right in all these other ways that are also useful and make money and are interesting. So I was thinking about it, I was talking about it with a student, and we were talking about the Lil Nas X album, I think, because they were debating its
the
merits
most
and
the
enjoying
most
it or
recent
whatever.
one, the most like
Yeah,
Montero.
yeah,
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
And I was actually like pretty surprised. They had all pretty good reviews about it. And I was like, oh, like, what do you like? How would you feel if we could write like album reviews? And they were like, he was like, that would be so cool And I was like, okay, great. Like that's an easy thing to put together because then we can read online like music blogs. We can see how people discuss like music and do analysis. And then the skill that I want to build at this level is like claim evidence reasoning, right? We can go through and identify like what claims are they making about the impact Lil Nas X is having on music? Like what evidence do they have to show for it? Like how are they elaborating at length, right, about these things? So, and it'll be fun. It'll give them an opportunity to tap in. And I was like, oh, we can read each other's reviews. Like we can comment on each other's thoughts, like, and actually participate in the world as it's happening, right? Mm-hmm. And like, who's not to say some of them are ready for their, eighth grade music blogging careers.
Yeah, maybe. Who knows? Maybe one of them in, a few years or 10 years, whatever, you'll see them writing for Rolling Stone or whatever else comes
or
after.
Who knows?
Yeah, or just like,
right.
Oh, that's so cool. I mean, and so I know, like, I kind of wanted to talk about that because and for those of you who are in chat or who are watching this VOD later, I am going to share the link to her blog, the Abundance Education blog, because I love your just entire concept for like teaching with abundance and wanting an abundance for your students and having. So if you could, I'd love if you explained a little bit about like what does that mean, the idea of abundance and teaching.
Yeah. So a couple things. I think that I love teaching, and also the past few years I've really struggled with how hard it has been to teach, right? Watching as like the cost of living go up, living in San Francisco, and the cost of rent are so expensive, and seeing in terms of teaching conditions, not only like the needle not shifting in the right direction, just like shifting in the wrong direction. Yeah. We have right now only 100 substitute teachers for the entire district of like San Francisco Unified, and like there's no end in sight of like, hiring, like raising their pay. About our paraeducators who work, like pretty much every paraeducator who supports our special ed students, like have to work at least 2 jobs because they don't get paid a living wage, right? And they do such incredible work with our youth with like IEPs and stuff. So honestly, I took the last year, did a lot of therapy, did a lot of personal development, and realized like I get so many scarcity signals in schools. Like we don't have enough money, we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough time. And I was like, oh, this isn't fruitful for me. So that was part of it, right? Yeah. And then the other side of it is like really being inspired, but feeling some limitations around the work of abolitionist education. Which has also really informed my work around like, I don't want to be an educator who punishes. I don't want to be an educator who is here to exist and create order, right? Which perpetuates anti-Blackness in the classroom.
Yep.
But also recognizing there's some interesting frameworks, like people talk about the school to prison pipeline, but also there are other things where people are like, no, it's not a pipeline. Like schools can be just as violent and punitive and as carceral as any other space. So some people call it the school prison nexus. I was like, honestly, like with all the expectations that they expect of us, especially as like a non-Black teacher, I feel nervous to say like, oh, I'm an abolitionist educator because here I am in the system, being paid by the system, trying to like uphold these expectations to kids. Like, I want to be careful about it. Like, I want to be committed to this world where we could, imagine a world without prisons, imagine a world where we don't have to resort to punishment and harm to like maintain order, but that we could just exist and build the right structures around each other to be well and stuff. So I think at the intersection of those two things was like something that I can hold and that I do feel like I can be successful doing is promoting as many like narratives of abundance and education as possible, right? I can't necessarily, overnight get us enough resources to be paid well for my students to have books for, students to have the paraeducators and the resource specialists they deserve. But what I can do is promote this idea that I recently saw a thing on Instagram about affirmations. So instead of affirmations, which sometimes feel like certainty, affirmations of what if. So, like what if we had, so like instead of we have all the resources we need, it's what if we had all the resources we need, right? What if like we have all the time that we need? What if there's no hurry or there's no rush, right, to learn and meet a standard? So for me, abundance is about that, even that emotional spaciousness, to be like, rather than seeing this with certainty, potentially there's enough space for us to relate to each other, to learn. Like there's no rush. But if I'm in the work of teaching students and trusting that they want to learn, then whatever we learn in the classroom today, whether it's the content that I thought we were doing or a conversation about homophobia because someone wrote something really terrible on the whiteboard, like those are both equally valuable learning moments, you know?
Totally.
And
totally.
There's no rush because the work is we learned something today, you know?
Oh, I think that's such a, I love that philosophy. And I love that it feels like it comes from a place of optimism and like seeing value in even when you deviate. Even when you deviate from the plan, like you can still find value in whatever else that you've created space for in that moment on that day.
Yeah. And I love
that
you mentioned hope because it makes me think of how we met as Warren Democrats.
I know.
You know, like
I have my my Elizabeth Warren bobblehead. My brother gave it to me for Christmas. He nailed it.
Yeah, but oh my gosh, like honestly, one of the things that made me super excited about Warren, right, was because she was pointing to a sense of abundance. She was saying there's definitely enough money to go around, and there's a way for us to do it, right? Like here, like, and she has such a sense of persistence of like we are gonna find the path that works, right? And for me, all of that informs like what abundance is. It's not only the abundance of resources, but the abundance of resourcefulness, right? That like we have the people and the community and the ideas, and we've just got to figure it out.
So, and just to confirm, this is the first time you've ever taught middle school before?
This is my first time teaching middle school. Yeah.
Okay. What do you have something that you're looking forward to the most in your like annual curriculum, or like is there something maybe that like you're used to teaching high schoolers, whatever, but yeah, what are you looking forward to most throughout your first year in middle school?
Oh my gosh, so much. Honestly,
or it can be a
all
bunch
of it. Like I'm just I'm excited to try out so much with them. It has been such a pleasure to teach U.S. history and the social studies with them. Today we talked about primary and secondary sources and bias with the Gabby Petito case because that's been all over social media. And then, I am really looking forward to, actually, for the past 5 years now, I've linked up with my ethnic studies coworker at my previous site and a professor at the University of San Francisco. And we have students read a graduate level reading, obviously excerpted with a ton of support. Yeah. And then we take a little crew of kiddos to have class with graduate students to talk about the text.
Wow.
So we're still doing that this year, and it'll be on queering education. And we'll do it over Zoom, obviously, for COVID safety reasons. But I am super curious if, like, my one, middle schoolers will be down, and two, how they're going to show up. So I'm really excited.
Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah. I mean, also, I'm trying to think of myself when I was like 13, 14, and it's such a transitional age because you're kind of just coming into your own. You're no longer like much of it. Like you're not really in your adolescence anymore. You're entering those teenage years, and I don't know. I feel like if I were sitting with like grad students and these people that I consider like, oh wow, they know their stuff. I feel like I'd kind of have that. Well, you have that sort of. I had like a false sense of confidence in like my own capabilities, which was probably good and like healthy. But to be a fly on the wall because I feel like I want to. I don't know, something to prove, or you're like, yeah, I can relate, because also 8th graders can be so freaking smart, and
they're so freaking smart.
Insightful.
Oh my god,
yeah.
They are a huge pleasure. So I'm super, super excited about, honestly, everything. Every day is a surprise. And I'm like, I don't know, I got like a random Post-it note today. And like, the ones that they were like, do you like me? Yes or no? But I got one that was like, what's on your mind? And it's like, are you in love? Are you bored? Are you zoning out? And like, please respond. And I was like, thanks. But it was like, you can check one or all. or whatever. It's up to you. Putting on
I
these
love this
post-it notes.
evolution of like note passing. That's fantastic. That's great because
So
they're like, yeah, you know what? You can, all these might apply to you. None of them might. Hmm, I love that. Oh, that's so great. Oh, and so like also sort of, and I want to be respectful of your time, but like
yeah.
you have also, so you're a teacher, but now that you have entered grad school, you're also back in like putting on your student hat. How has
Oh yeah.
how has that been so far?
Honestly, really nice. Like it's so nice. I have a cohort of 20 people. We're doing a doctoral degree in social justice leadership, and everyone in the cohort is so engaging and so committed. And you know the centering the students and our futures is so real. And I am just in admiration. It's nice. Honestly, I keep thinking I am tired, admittedly. But also it's so nice to be in a community with folks who are really trying to imagine new paths for our students.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, that was part of the reason you chose this because it's a newer program, right? So you're able
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
to have a little bit more influence in like
Yes.
what you're studying. So,
Yeah.
in a nutshell, and then I'll give you an outro so that you can have your evening back. But in a nutshell, like what is your focus right thus far? Obviously, you know it might change, but it's social justice seems to be like the core component, but more like
Hmm.
specifically, what types of things are you looking at in your,
Yeah.
whether it's research, whether it's just like coursework, but what's your focus?
Yeah. Well, right now in our coursework, we're taking some general classes, but they're really wonderful. So, a class on servant leadership, on leading for diversity, equity, inclusion. I have a class on instructional leadership. We did foundations of doctoral studies, and we talked about the realities of being in academia again. So, that's all been great. And then personal interests are very personal, obviously, to me, but I'm really thinking through the concept of moral injury, which is a concept that originated in, you know, combat veterans and has been applied increasingly during the pandemic to medical professionals and now teachers,
Yeah,
which is something deeper than burnout, but this idea that like we are feeling not only that we are witnessing, but sometimes even like perpetrating harm because we are ill equipped and ill resourced, right? And that has a particular impact on teachers psychologically and is contributing to teacher turnover. So um, I'm really interested in that particular area right now. What does it look like to create conditions and prevent moral injury, right? And increasingly with my research, I'm like, oh, honestly, we actually at the pre-service level I think we need a lot of conversations around boundaries as teachers, even before we enter the profession, because I think thinking through most of our educational journeys, I don't think very many of us had explicit conversations in schools and learning settings about how to set boundaries.
totally. I mean, and that's sort of like, first of all, way to like bring it full circle on the conversation and where this started on like setting boundaries. So, I mean, that is one big takeaway that I think we could all use. I mean, teachers and everyone. I think in the past year, especially, I've thought about what does boundary setting mean when you're doing it with your career, when you're doing it with
Yep.
your job, just how much are
Yep.
you willing to give, but where do you draw the line, and then how do you communicate that?
Yep.
And I mean, I love, and to everyone, I will share Annie's Twitter as well. I learned so much from you on Twitter about not only education, but just thinking more, uh, thinking about more meaningful ways to like confront my own like biases on things and how I engage with people, because in some effect we are all teachers in different aspects of our lives, and I
Yes. Yes.
view,
Yes.
and so I also view my own education as ongoing, continuing
Mm-hmm.
forever, and so it makes me think too about like, well, how am I processing this information? Like how can I try to face the world or face a new challenge with a sense of abundance and have that mindset. So, like Annie, uh, I love everything about you. You're great. I've already
I
told
love
you.
everything about you. I'm such a fan. Thank you for creating these pieces. Honestly, you've always been such a fearless advocate. I am a huge fan.
Yeah, and I already told you. I'm like, I really hope my kids have you as a teacher. I'm like you. I love kids. They put me with when I was a swim instructor. They always put me with the quote problem kids, which I always hated because I'm like, no, they tell you what, like, kids don't have a filter. They'll tell you how they feel and what
Yes.
they need
Yes.
and what they want. And like, if you just like are
Listen.
receptive to that, and then, or you're just like, okay, well, because some kids are different. It's like, okay, one thing's going to motivate one kid, one thing's going to like motivate the other. But if I'm like, hey, here's what we're doing today. How do we feel about this? Great. Like, let's work on this together. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I always felt it was like I never had any trouble with it. And you know what? Some kids, like, if they're having a meltdown because they're tired and it's just not their day, it's okay.
Yep.
It's okay. I've had that day too. I think we all have.
Yep.
So, but yeah, so Annie, again, like, I want to thank you for taking the time to come back here and talk about everything that you are working on, that you care about and are passionate about. Your perspective is so invaluable. And you know, maybe in a few months we'll have you back on, and we'll
I'm
see
down.
how life's going over at the middle school.
Sounds good. Oh, thanks. So good to see you.
So good to see you. To everyone, say bye to Annie. Bye. Bye. Thank you
Bye.
again.